There's a scene in A Dance with Dragons where a character hears his own real name spoken out loud, and instead of feeling relief, he flinches, physically flinches, like the word itself might be a weapon. That character used to be called Theon Greyjoy. By the time we get to that scene, he answers to something else entirely. And I think that single detail, a man recoiling from his own name, tells you more about what actually happened to him than any of the torture scenes people usually bring up when his story comes up. Most conversations about Theon split into two camps, and I've noticed neither one actually sits with the whole picture. Half the fandom remembers him as the guy who betrayed the Starks, took Winterfell, and more or less deserved whatever came next. The other half remembers him purely as Ramsay's victim fingers, skin, a torture montage people find genuinely hard to watch. Both of those readings are true, in isolated moments. Neither of them explains why he broke the way he did, or why what Ramsay did to him worked so completely. Here's what I keep coming back to when I read this arc closely. Ramsay didn't build Theon's collapse from nothing. He found a foundation that was already cracked, going back decades, and he simply knew exactly where to press. He was never fully Stark. He was never fully Greyjoy, so there was nothing left to hold on to when they took his name. I want to sit with that sentence for a second, because I think it's the actual key to this entire character, and almost nobody frames it that way. Go back to the very beginning of who Theon is. He's 9 years old when Balon Greyjoy's rebellion fails, and as part of the peace terms, Ned Stark takes him as a ward, which is a polite word for hostage. He grows up in Winterfell, technically part of the Stark household, treated with something like family warmth by Ned and Catelyn and the children. But I think it's worth being honest about what he actually is in that house. A constant reminder of a war his family lost, living under a roof that could, in theory, execute him the moment his father stepped out of line again. You can be raised somewhere and still never fully belong there. Theon experiences both of those things simultaneously, for years, as a child too young to process what that split does to a person's sense of self. So when Robb goes to war and Theon finally gets a chance to prove himself to his actual blood to go home, to matter to the family he was taken from, I don't think it's really about strategy or ambition. I think it's about a starving kid finally getting a shot at being wanted somewhere, fully, without conditions attached. It does not go how he needs it to. Balon barely looks at him like a son. There's a moment in the books that I find almost unbearably specific. His own father essentially tells him he's become more Stark than Greyjoy, that Ned raised the Ironborn out of him. Think about the position that puts Theon in. He spent his entire childhood being the outsider in Winterfell, and now he goes home and gets told he doesn't belong there either. Two families. Zero acceptance from either one, delivered almost back to back. I think that's the actual engine behind Winterfell. Not greed, not political calculation. A desperate, half-formed attempt to finally force anyone, to take him seriously as something other than a leftover hostage nobody quite wanted. He takes the castle almost entirely alone. His own sister Asha doesn't back the plan. Nobody advises him into it. It's the loneliest decision in his entire storyline, made by someone who has run out of families willing to claim him. And then it curdles into something genuinely indefensible. He has two innocent farm boys killed and displayed as Bran and Rickon, faking the deaths of children he grew up alongside, to maintain the illusion that he's still in control of a situation that was slipping out of his hands the entire time. I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing, or excuse it away, but I think it's worth noticing what it actually reveals. A man performing power he does not have, because the alternative is admitting, out loud, that neither family he was born into or raised in was ever going to give him the one thing he actually wanted. That's the foundation Ramsay finds when Winterfell falls. He was never fully Stark. He was never fully Greyjoy. So there was nothing left to hold on to when they took his name. What happens next is not, I think, best understood as random cruelty. It's closer to something surgical. Ramsay doesn't just hurt Theon physically, he takes fingers, skin, does damage that would break almost anyone on its own, but the actual weapon, the thing that does the lasting work, is smaller and quieter than any of that. He takes his name. He renames him Reek, and then he makes him say it, over and over, in a rhyme designed to stick. Reek, Reek. It rhymes with until repetition does what torture alone couldn't finish doing. I think this detail matters more than almost anything else in the arc, because it isn't punishment for its own sake. its replacement. Ramsay isn't trying to make Theon suffer as Theon. He's trying to make sure there's no Theon left to suffer as anyone specific at all. And it works, disturbingly well, precisely because of what we already know about him. A person with a firmly rooted sense of self might survive that kind of psychological siege with something intact underneath it. Theon never had that rooted self to begin with. He spent his whole life being told, gently in Winterfell and bluntly on Pike, that he wasn't quite who either family needed him to be. So when someone finally hands him a complete, simple identity, Reek, obedient, nameless, safe, as long as he stays small, some genuinely broken part of him accepts it, because at least it's a role nobody's going to contest. By the time we get inside his head in A Dance with Dragons, Martin actually rewrites the internal narration itself. The thoughts on the page belong to someone calling himself Reek, not Theon. I don't think that's a stylistic flourish. I think it's the most direct depiction of dissociative identity fracture that this entire saga contains. A mind that has genuinely, functionally replaced itself to survive conditions the original self couldn't withstand. When he hears his actual name spoken later, it doesn't land as comfort. It lands as danger, because Reek learned that being Theon is what got him tortured in the first place. He was never fully Stark. He was never fully Greyjoy. So there was nothing left to hold on to when they took his name. There's a moment that I think is one of the most quietly devastating scenes Martin ever wrote, and it barely gets talked about compared to the finger scene or the flaying. Ramsay forces Reek to stand witness at his own wedding, marrying a girl passed off as Arya Stark, in the very castle Theon once tried to claim as his own conquest, once called home as a hostage child before that. He is made to watch his old life get worn like a costume by the person who destroyed him, and he has to stand there as Reek, not allowed to feel anything about it, because Theon is the one who would have felt something, and Theon isn't safe to be anymore. That's not just cruelty stacked on cruelty. That's Ramsay making Reek watch the funeral of the person he used to be, and forcing him to attend it in character. So when Theon finally does something that looks like Theon again helping Sansa escape Winterfell, choosing, for the first time in years, to risk himself for someone else, instead of just surviving, I don't think it reads as triumphant. I think Martin very deliberately keeps it fragile. He still calls himself Reek half the time while he's doing it. The bravery and the broken identity are happening simultaneously, not sequentially. He isn't cured. He's just, for one single moment, choosing to act like the person he used to be, even while the voice in his head is still arguing about which name actually belongs to him. I keep thinking about how this lines up with something else this saga does, in a completely different corner of a completely different story. There's a creature obsessed with a golden ring who used to have a name too, Smeagol, before centuries of possession ground that name down into something smaller, meaner, and safer to be. Gollum isn't Theon's story exactly, but the mechanism is the same one, just stretched across different timelines and different forms of possession. Something outside of you decides who you're allowed to be, repeats it long enough, and eventually the old name stops fitting the way it used to. What actually makes Theon's arc worth taking seriously, I think, isn't the torture. It's the fact that the torture succeeded specifically because of a wound that existed years before Ramsay ever touched him. Two families that each, in their own quiet way, told a child he wasn't quite theirs. A man who spent his entire life trying to force belonging out of people who were never going to fully offer it. And then someone came along who understood exactly how little he had left to defend and took the very last thing, his own name, because there was nothing sturdier left underneath it to protect. He was never fully Stark. He was never fully Greyjoy. So there was nothing left to hold on to when they took his name. If you had spent your whole childhood being almost family in two different houses, never quite either ones, how much would it actually take to convince you that you weren't really anyone specific at all? I think that question is harder than it sounds, and I think Theon Greyjoy is the answer to it. Written out in exactly the amount of detail most people rush past on their way to the parts of his story that are easier to watch. He got his name back, eventually, in pieces, the way you'd expect someone to get back something that took that long to lose. Not all at once, not completely. Just enough, finally, to answer to it again, without flinching.